Let's explain what happened here. Remember that an element with a float applied to it gets plucked out of the flow. Let's look at the HTML. We have three divs. Each div has an image and a p. The images have a float, and so they are plucked out of the flow. If the image is plucked out of the flow, then the p, which is the element coming after it, will take its place. So if image were number 1, now it no longer is number 1, it belongs in the float world, and p becomes number 1, so it takes its place. P is the child of the div element, and so the div element stretches only far enough to contain the p. Let's look at that. So the div, each of those gray rectangles is the div class rectangle, right? And the div is stretching only as high enough as its p child is, but it's not stretching further to contain the image. You see this first div? It's not stretching all the way to the bottom of the first image to contain it, because the image is no longer the child, so to speak, of the div, because it has been plucked out. What can we do so that this parent div, the div class rectangle, stretches far enough to contain its child? There are many ways, many creative ways to solve this problem. One way is by giving the div class rectangle a new child. Let me show you how. So right after P, we insert a new child. It can be a div, which opens and closes. We'll give that div a class called dummy. Okay? And we go to style, and here we say div dot dummy, open close curly braces, clear right. So what are we doing? Let's repeat this whole thing. We have the image element, it has a float right. We created this new child, which is an imaginary thin transparent line. This div is a transparent line. There's nothing there, we don't see it, but it exists. By virtue of existing, we can do something to it. So we're basically telling this third child of the div class rectangle, we're telling it there's a float right before you. Why don't you go under that obstacle so that your parent div class rectangle stretches far enough to contain you? That's what we're doing. That's why we gave it a clear right. Now let's see what happens with the first rectangle. Okay, that's it. We solved the problem. So if we do the same thing to the remaining two rectangles, we won't have that problem anymore. So this is a creative way of solving the problem. Again, take this div class dummy, copy it, and let it be the third child of the second div class rectangle. Let it be the third child of the third div class rectangle. And obviously, since they have the same class, they will follow the property called clear right. Let's save this, refresh, and we're good. So this is beautiful. Okay, now all we need to do is obviously style this text, because it's stuck on the top left corner, there's no padding around it, and so far so forth. This is just fun. The most important thing is the layout, and the rest is, if we have just some artistic abilities, we'd be able to style nicely. So let's go ahead and do that. Div dot rectangle space p. Let's make the font size 13 pixels, line height 17 pixels, or actually 20 pixels to make it nice. Remember, line height is the equivalent of leading in Illustrator, the space between lines of text. Let's make the color, currently it's black on light gray, it's a bit too hard, I think. We can make it like a nice dark gray on light gray, which is nicer. And then some padding all around so that we don't see this, the text touching the left and the top. So padding 30 pixels. And let's see how this looks. Okay, so this is really nice. There's nice line height. The text is big enough, but not too big. Really very decent. Okay, so we're done with the About page. We really in depth learned about the floats. Hopefully we understood what all the floats are about. Let's look at a last little thing. On my Firefox, I'm going to go to View, Zoom, and Zoom Text Only. Okay? So what this will do is when I hold down the Command key and hit the plus sign, it will zoom only the text. Let me show you. That's what I'm doing. Okay, the images remain the same size, but the text increases in size. Okay, so I'm just showing you that it's a decent increase in size. Everything looks organic and everything is fine. Now, if I go ahead and do the following, which is never ever recommended, but let me show you just what happens. I'm going to go ahead and give the div.rectangle a height. This is our div.rectangle, this gray space, okay? I'm going to go ahead and first let me zoom back out. So I'm going to hold down the Command key and hit the letter 0 to go back to my normal view. And I'm going to give the div.rectangle a height. Let's say 70 pixels. Okay? And refresh. That was too narrow. Let me make it 200 pixels or 180. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in now, and I just want to show you what's happening. You see that the text from the first paragraph is overlapping on the text of the second paragraph and overlapping on the text of the third paragraph. This is very bad design practice, okay? The mistake we made here was to give the div.rectangle a height. This is wrong because we are forcing a div to have a certain height, while we shouldn't, because we should let it increase in size and decrease in size organically. Okay? Whenever we force a height on a div that contains text, it means that whenever a user zooms in, this mess will happen. Okay? So let the divs have their own organic height. Let them be as high as the children they contain. If this image is this high, let the parent div be high enough to contain it. If there's text that is this big or more, let the div be big enough to contain it, but never force a height to a div. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this, save, and refresh the page. So now even if I zoom in, there will no longer be that overlap of text because I removed that fixed height from the div, and so the div now increases in height organically as high or as big as its children are.